I'll maybe just invite each of them to say a few words now, just on, like, to be honest, although this is called Writing Dublin, New York, Writing Dublin, Writing New York, we all have varied experiences in terms of where we're from and where we're living now, and where we've been in between. But so we could, if each of them would share just you know, the history of the cities in which they have lived, or the places in which they have lived, and that'll kind of give us the context for which the discussion will follow on from there. And we're only here for a short 45 minutes or so, but I'm going to ask as well that, as well as discussing, that each of them will get to read maybe just a short piece from their work, so that you get a flavour of the work that they're doing as well. So anyway, just to start then with Keith, just Keith, explain yourself, young man.
Is this working?
Yes.
Well, I was born in Dublin and spent the best part of the first 30 years of my life in Dublin. So I guess in terms of cities, Dublin tops the list in the way it's influenced me. But I then moved to London, where I lived for about the last 11 years. And at the end of last year, I moved from London to Edinburgh. And each of these cities, I suppose, influences my writing. But it's one of those things that is difficult until you're actually asked at a forum like this. It's difficult to quantify or measure. And it's something that actually it's difficult to even think about, because of course you know you can't compare it to anything else. You are where you are, you write what you write. You're never quite sure where it's coming from or what's feeding into it. And I think there's other places where I've spent less time over the years. For example, I spent about a year in Italy, in Florence, between Dublin and London. And that should have had an influence on me, on my writing. And I wanted it to. I wanted it to have a big influence on my writing. But in fact, of all the places I've lived, it was hopeless. It had no influence on my writing whatsoever. And it's completely vanished, and you would never know from reading anything I've ever written that I've ever spent any time in Italy whatsoever. And contrary to that, I spent, as a young man, I spent, I think it was 4 or 5 months here in New York when I was a student. I spent an extended summer living and working in New York. And that, even at this stage, has, I think, had quite a long-lasting influence on me, and that's the basis of the piece that's appeared in this magazine, the fiction that I've written for this issue of the Stinging Fly. So it's hard to know. You would think that Dublin would be the main influence on me. You would think that London would be second, and the others would, but it doesn't quite work like that, and it's hard to quantify what effect each place has, and it's hard to trace it.
Yeah, hello. I was born and brought up in Cookstown, County Tyrone, which is northwest Ireland, and I left as soon as that was legal when I was 18. And I went to England and studied, and then I lived in London for a while and worked as a lawyer. And I lived in Warsaw in Poland for a year. Then I lived in Boston. Then I lived back in London. Then I was in Rome for a couple of years, in Italy. And then it's been in New York for the last few years. I teach up at Columbia. And I think out of all of them, actually, New York is the best city for writers. Writers are so protective of their time for work, and in New York you can pay people to do everything for you. So someone comes and takes your dirty clothes and brings them back clean, and someone brings you food, and so it's useful for a writer. I think in New York as well has had the most appreciable impact on my work, certainly recently. I write poetry and novels, and at the minute I'm just finishing a poetry book, and there's a lot of New York in it. There's a sort of tremendous amount of energy in New York as soon as you step into the street, and all of the kind of crosstalk and the eavesdropping and stuff sort of infects the poetry, I think. If you're sitting in a field in the north of Ireland, you write a certain kind of poem, and if you're sort of down in Washington Square, you write a different kind. So I think it's exciting. I've been really enjoying it.
Thank you. Emer?
Okay, my name is Emer Martin, and he gets very excited when I say that.
Every time.
Every time, every time.
Let's say it again, please.
My name is Emer Martin. I grew up in Dublin, and I don't think I ever forgave Dublin for, I suppose, for growing up in it, and for not being a glittering city on the Mediterranean, for being dirty and drab and claustrophobic and
But it's very wet at the moment as
mean-spirited,
well.
and yeah, it's flooded at the moment. But yeah, and I remember when people said, when I moved to America, people said, "Did you go to your prom?" And I said, "No, we didn't have the prom in Ireland. We had emigration. We just finished school and got out of the country, and that's what most people did." So I went to Paris and London and Cairo and lived in Israel, lived in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and lived all over the place. But like most people, I remember that coming to New York was so different from the other places, because those other places all belonged to their countries, you know. Like Paris belongs very much to France, but New York doesn't really belong to America, and that's what struck me. It was like I had arrived at the capital of the world, and everybody was here, and it wasn't just one dominating ethnic group. And when I'd go back to Dublin, I would feel I was indoors. There was only Irish people at the time. But New York, I felt I was outside, I was in the world. And that had, I lived here 10 years. I went to Hunter College. And I guess it had you know, at the time, and still now, that if you want to make films, you go to LA. If you want to go to lifestyle, you go to San Francisco. But if you want to be a writer, New York was the place. It was where everybody was at. Like, you could do a brilliant reading in San Francisco or Seattle and get a great audience, but in New York you'd meet people. There'd be editors, there'd be publishers. It was different. It was where the industry was at, and probably will always be, even with e-books and everything. There'll have to be a center where people are at, and I think it's still New York. So when I left New York in the year 2000, I didn't quite realize what I was doing, but it was like walking off the map. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was that feeling of really of disappearing when I left New York that I felt very vividly, and it was very frightening, because I always felt very apparent and alive in New York. And then, but I suppose as a writer it's good, as an artist it's very good to walk off the map every now and then, because the map, being on the map, is comfortable, and being surrounded by the industry people and being surrounded where everybody is comfortable. But it was certainly, I've always the fantasy I would move back here again. It felt like home. As an Irish person, New York felt more familiar than Dublin, because we'd seen New York visually in films and everything. So when you come here, it has that resonance, that familiar feeling that no other city really has.
Hi. Well, I'm gonna speak up for Dublin. I'm not going to let this pass. I'm born in the North Ireland, in Derry, and like Nick, left as soon as I could, and lived in Paris for a while. I was up in Scandinavia for a long while, Spain, stuff like that. And I've been to New York a few times, and the thing that used to annoy me about being here was that everyone thought what a great place it was to be a writer. That was New York finished for me. I wanted out. I find myself living in Dublin these days, and despite everything that's happened, that the country was just fell into the wrong hands, basically. And the dire conditions that a lot of people are living under there now, and what has been done to the people there. I still love Dublin. It has some of the best qualities of all those other cities that I've lived in. It reminds me a lot of Paris in the sense it's just small enough you can walk around. It's see people on the street. It's like a little village. But there's an added quality for me, and I think it's part of my own personality. I was brought up in the north to despise Dublin and the whole Free State as a country of cards, and I now find myself living in the midst of it, almost in a kind of internal exile there. It's a very interesting experience being a northerner in Dublin. It never ceases to amaze me what you actually run into and what people say to you. Simply about my accent, really, because I don't live there anymore, and I've lived out of the place a lot longer than I ever lived there. So that, it brings up challenges and contradictions in me and very difficult feelings, and those are the type of things that I like to sit down and write about, rather than what a wonderful city I'm living in. I like to write out of just an anguish, and Dublin gives me plenty of anguish.
I'll stick with Sean maybe just there on, following on to that, maybe you could talk a little bit about the swing of things and the story of that novel, which was your 2004 book, and which was set in Dublin, and it is about a character who moves from the north to Dublin and studies at Trinity. So, so some of the things you mentioned there obviously are potent in the novel. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. The novel was originally begun in Paris, actually, and it was set in Paris. Some of the original stories in it came from when I was living there. But events beyond my control forced me back to Dublin. So I said, what am I doing? I might as well set this book in Dublin, as I am here. One of the ideas for me was I wanted to just force myself to think about some of the prisoners who were released under the Good Friday Agreement, and then some of the opportunities that were given to them by that agreement, namely to go to university and study and try and remake their life, reinvent themselves, rebuild themselves, do something different with themselves. So that was the main character I wanted, so I just pushed him around Dublin. But in saying that, and I think this is quite interesting, that in a sense of what a character is and what the experience of being in a place is that you very quickly come up against what the basic human senses, the physical senses of sight and sound, and taste and smell, but particularly sight. And what I found writing about this character was that I had to prevent him looking around because I didn't really believe that he was able to look around. In the sense that we're all blinded by our own experience. We're blinded by what we bring with us. And I think it's maybe a bit too easy to imagine like that we're all tourists and we just walk around absorbing the wonderful buildings and sights and sounds that are around us. I find that the character actually is bringing all of the stuff with them, and they are actually, that is flowing out of their eyes into their visual field, and so that they are like, almost like a ghost in a physical landscape, rather than a camera accurately recording or making interesting social observations about the physical landscape that they find themselves generally imprisoned in. We don't actually have that much choice about where we are, in spite of all this movement that we're all talking about. Most of us.
I think though it's true though that writers move as much, I suppose, as any other people, but writers' lives and where they live depends very much on what opportunities they have in a particular place at a particular time. So I mean, it's very much dictated, as to what economically you can afford, or where there is a teaching position, or where there's no teaching position, or where you can scrape together a living, or there's a home available to you, basically. So those things kind of probably colour or influence the writer's decision as to where they live, as opposed to any kind of great affection or love for a particular place.